G'day, AJ Mahari here. And this is really the third video that people should watch after they've watched. Um, well, I'm not sure what the exact title will be at the time of this recording, but the video about, what is a vulnerable narcissist, or what's the difference between a vulnerable narcissist, a covert, and a inverted narcissist, which the answer is nothing. So anyway, the first video to watch would be about the vulnerable narcissist, however I title it. The second video after that, these are a series of three at the moment, would be, you know, the definition of a quiet borderline, the explanation about a quiet borderline. And then this video, which is that answering the question, are vulnerable or covert narcissists the same as quiet borderlines, or are quiet borderlines the same as covert vulnerable narcissists? So again, the question that a lot of people are asking out there online all over the place, who've experienced someone with BPD in their lives or still are, um, and maybe really hurt and lost and confused and trying to figure things out and can't get closure, difficulty with any type of relationship, whether it's mother of, or adult child of, or significant other of, or friend, or whatever the case may be. So I found this quote, and I wasn't looking for anything on the subject at all. I was just booting it around and googling some stuff, and I wasn't even, I don't think, searching for anything to do with borderline personality disorder or whatever. But this just popped up in a search. I can't remember what I was actually searching for. So the quote that I found, and I don't remember the website I found it. I'm sorry, because I just typed it out, and I'm just reading now from my notes. But this quote, somebody wrote this online. So this personal point of view that someone wrote online, out of their own exasperation and trying to figure out what they've been through and get closure, they kind of were mentioning. Quote, this is what somebody else wrote, with some name, like, I don't know who it is, but quote, it seems like BPD and NPD are both about the same, a combination of infantile trauma and amygdala malfunction that prevents them from securely attaching. It manifests in slightly different manners, but in the end, it's all an attachment disorder. End quote. Well, I'm eternally frustrated by this, but anyway, here we go. Because I'm trying to be helpful, and I hope that this will be helpful to people who might agree with that quote, because I don't think it's really accurate. These disorders are not at all the same. Do they have some overlapping similarities in how they come about? Yes. Do they have some overlapping similarities in parts of what the traits are or what the issues are? Yes, because that's why they were both, I mean, me and the DSM, but that's, I guess, why psychiatry and the DSM-5 has put them both in the same cluster group, right? Cluster B. There's similarities, but they're not the same personality disorders, okay, as I've done videos about before. But so many believe that they are the same for whatever reasons. And then I wonder sometimes the way that the DSM changed personality disorders in DSM-5, listing 10, dropping some, moving things, and something I'm going to do videos on too coming up soon. Taking Asperger's and shoving it in with classic autism and on autistic spectrum. So they did a lot of like moving. So whenever things overlapped, they seemed to wanted to either take one out, like they took histrionic personality disorder out of cluster B. It doesn't make any sense to me. They leave sadistic personality disorder out. So anyway, uh, I think psychiatry has an agenda to push these disorders, and maybe people are just getting confused aside from that, but maybe there's something about that where people are getting confused, and maybe psychiatry has some agenda to push these personality disorders and or others more or less together, increasing comorbidity, although I must say comorbidity is, I think, exponentially increasing in a few patterned ways, and I won't speak of the others right now, but in particular, comorbidity of people being duly diagnosed, like with borderline personality and comorbid narcissistic personality disorder. And I'm not even sure if when they're diagnosed with the comorbidity of these two personality disorders, if they're told they have borderline personality disorder and perhaps not told they have narcissistic personality disorder, or how many people are fitting this pattern and either being diagnosed with the second personality disorder, NPD, but not being told, or just fitting the pattern and haven't been diagnosed yet, or somebody missed it. Hard to say. But I've had a lot more clients that come to me either diagnosed or not, but I'm not making the diagnosis, but I could recognize the patterns. I worked with so many clients with BPD, so many endless clients, endless numbers with BPD, endless numbers of loved ones. And then I've worked with so many people with mid-range or narcissistic traits, mid-range narcissistic personality disorder. And then I've worked with so many people who have borderline comorbid with narcissistic personality disorder, or people who have comorbid 3 traits of BPD and 2 or 3 traits of NPD. There's that as well. And how do I discern that? Well, people read and people think, they come to me and say, this is what I think I have in terms of traits. And then the other thing is pattern recognition. So nobody's advocating that anybody who isn't a diagnostician or, a shrinker who's ever really doing all the diagnosing, we shouldn't be diagnosing. That's true. So anyway, I think, like psychiatry, again, pushing maybe comorbidity, but it is on the increase in several cases of types of comorbidity, like bipolar and borderline, which I don't know much about bipolar, but I'm going to do something about that and read more. I had a partner who had bipolar disorder, so I certainly have experienced it from the other side, but I need to know more about it to do a video. But in other clusters and across the clusters, there are very common comorbid personality disorder diagnoses that are common. But in cluster B, the most common is borderline personality disorder comorbid with narcissistic personality disorder. So it's just not accurate to say they're the same personality disorder, because they're not. And it's not known what keeps an infant from attaching. Oh, yeah, it's not known what keeps an infant from attaching. It's not an amygdala malfunction at all, as that person that I quoted from the internet somewhere said. In fact, it's the other way around. For those diagnosed, and of course that usually happens after either in late adolescence or early adulthood, they actually will be diagnosed with BPD. It is the lack of secure attachment or trauma bonding and abandonment with people with BPD. I mean, that end up being diagnosed with BPD. That's really what the issues are. And so the abandonment, trauma, and or perceived or actual, the attachment trauma as well, that negatively impacts brain development. It absolutely does. And areas are related in areas that are related to emotional regulation, but it's not. The first thing I want to say is it's not a chemical imbalance in the brain at all. Okay, and secondly, due to the neuroplasticity we now understand about the brain, like when I recovered from borderline personality disorder in 1995, what did that recovery entail amongst all the other things that I talk about at different times? I totally did rewire my brain. We didn't even know that was the case at the time, but it happened regardless because of the neuroplasticity that people didn't yet understand when I recovered in 1995, or we're just beginning to explore. So changing your thoughts and really changing your thoughts creates new neural pathways. And then neurons start to travel in new ways according to the thoughts, because thoughts are energy. And then they will cross the synapses, or however you say that, in all different manners of ways. And that is the brain rewiring level down deep from on out that people with BPD like myself who recovered can really recover and know they are recovered, because I just have never thought the same way ever since that recovery, and probably 3 or 4 years before I was actually recovered. The changes were constant and growing and gaining momentum, and my brain was actually being rewired. So neuroplasticity will address whatever abandonment trauma and or attachment trauma and a lack of bond or a trauma bond how it impacts negatively the brain in those with BPD. But it's not caused by a malfunctioning amygdala, or not that anybody can prove. And so that person kind of had it backwards, in my opinion. And the best I know of, what they've actually studied so far. Not that they have any like totally ironclad conclusions based on those studies. So I think also it's really important to say that, you know, the attachment trauma and abandonment trauma, um, perceived or actual in the case of abandonment, for people that will go on to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, to say that, it's like a malfunctioning amygdala or something like that, that there's something there besides a sensitive temperament, which I think we know is there, that would preclude the infant from attaching, almost makes it sound like it's the infant's fault. And it's never the infant's fault. It's never the child's fault, even if it's a misperceived situation. And in 25% of all those diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, of course, the mothers are what psychology calls good enough mothers. That's not my judgment. Those are psychological words, right? That it's perception based, but it's still not necessarily mom's fault then, and it's not the infant's fault either. It's just that mirroring and that, it's affect synchrony, as Alan M. Shore describes, and it's just a lack. It's this misattunement that can happen, and in 25% of cases, it happens with a good enough mother due to the sensitive temperament maybe of the infant. But anyway, and then there's 75% where it occurs because of inconsistencies or cluster B parents, like the mother's cluster B themselves, or emotionally unavailable or narcissistic, or whatever the case. And so 75% of the time it's actual trauma and abandonment, and what abandonment can be is like a big long list too. So anyway, I'll keep moving on here. So people like loved ones and ex-loved ones of those with NPD or BPD, or suspected one or the other, or comorbidly both, in any relationship type, okay? So it could be a friend, could be a love, could be a partner, could be a girlfriend, boyfriend, could be a parent, adult, child, any kind of relationship type. People after they go through this, or mothers as they continue to go through this, or adult children of people with BPD as they continue, mothers especially, or a father, that they continue to grapple with what's happening to them, and how the person with BPD that is like, kind of like they're in a parallel universe, the way they think with what they're trying to cope with, and how they don't have coping skills and know who they are. So loved ones are in need of such an understanding that can, to some measure or other, they believe, provide them with, like, whether you go no contact or not, that you can somehow get closure from this, almost obsessive in some people's part seeking of what exactly was wrong with them, and were they borderline, and maybe they were borderline and narcissist, and that can happen, but like that's not because they're the same personality disorder, BPD and NPD, okay? It's because they can comorbidly exist in one person. In many different people, they do. I read 37%, and that's an old statistic. I saw 42% recently that people diagnosed with BPD will also be diagnosed with NPD. So the catch-22 is when you are, when the ongoing and often, yeah, when this ongoing search online for all these answers to try to get closure becomes almost this obsessive need to figure out the diagnosis when you're probably not, like a psychiatrist or a diagnosing mental health professional. So, um, you want to get that right somehow so that you'll have the penultimate understanding, and that's going to fix it, right? Um, well, not necessarily. It helps, and people need some understanding, and that's understandable, but it doesn't really give the whole closure. Any diagnosis should be done by a professional, and pattern recognition or wondering or listening to YouTubers like me and others or reading blogs, you might go, "Oh yeah, they did that, not." So then, but the point is obsessively over trying to focus on that, like if you've gone no contact or if you're backing out of a relationship or you've tried your best with a friend but it with BPD but it's not working out, um the more you think that act of seeking to understand beyond a certain understanding that will help in your healing from any abuse from somebody with BPD or any trauma, um then you're in an active codependent mindset that you've got to now figure it out, get the whole picture somehow by yourself, all that understanding, or you can't move forward and you can't get closure. Well, that's what healing processes with people like myself are about, helping you to get enough understanding, but helping you to also understand yourself, helping to understand the whole dynamic, helping to understand a lot of things that you're not going to figure out in a codependent mindset, thinking that if you could just figure it all out about them, whoa, okay, phew, I'm out of there. I can move on now. It doesn't work that way because of the trauma, because of the abuse, because of the pain. People now have their own issues and need their own recovery after being in relationships to or with or ongoing, no contact with adult, for the adult child or the mother of or the father of somebody with BPD. So, the differences between the vulnerable, otherwise called covert or inverted narcissist, and the quiet borderline. And I want to focus on that right now. Many people who have been in relationships or still are with someone with cluster B or any type of suspected borderline personality disorder or cluster B personality disorder um, are trying to figure out if they were relating to or dealing with a vulnerable narcissist or a person with borderline personality disorder, or did I think it was a borderline, but it was really a vulnerable narcissist or covert narcissist. Um, Leaving out the ever increasing possibility, too, by the way, that the person could have been comorbidly borderline and narcissistic personality disorder. So that I think is pushing a lot of confusion and a lot of people who have a lot of different things to say about their experience. That doesn't mean then people are like just talking more and more away from, trying to put these two personality disorders together when they aren't the same. But you will see both in somebody who's got them both comorbidly, right? That's obvious, but a lot of people don't understand or haven't figured out yet that a person can have both BPD and NPD, and what does that look like? And then, of course, it's more confusing, but they're still not the same personality disorder, even when they're comorbidly in the same person. So when it comes to the covert vulnerable person with narcissistic personality disorder and the quiet borderline, the line where one classification ends of one of those personality disorders, and there is a line, and the other one begins, to many people out there, who've never experienced this before and are trying to figure it out, seems really blurry or even non-existent, and people think they're the same personality disorder. So many non-personality disorder people wonder, if the person they thought, the person they were with, whatever relationship type or whatever, that were hurt by, and maybe traumatized by somebody with borderline personality disorder. Well, maybe they were narcissistic personality disorder because I don't know, or they think they were with a narcissist, but then they think, well, maybe they were borderline personality disorder. I don't know. Um, there may have been some overlapping features, experienced by loved ones, but the true similarity, it actually lies more in causation. Okay, it really does. The causation that we know about. Um, what happens to people who get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, that emotional arrested development coming at the phase of early childhood development around age 2. And for those who go on to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, a similar intrapsychic narcissistic injury. So similarity in causation, and they're both called narcissistic injuries, whether it's BPD or NPD. But it happens in a different phase and stage of early childhood development, and that makes all the difference. And that's why they're not exactly the same. And it happens for those who want to be diagnosed with NPD between the ages of 3 and 4. An emotional arrested development occurs. And so there's a lot going on there. So anyway, I know that loved ones of any relationship type often get abused, often are traumatized, have a lot of confusion, tremendous pain and heartache. And so why wouldn't there be on your part, if this resonates with you, this feeling like you need to understand it, that somehow that would make you all better? It doesn't, but you do need to understand it. But BPD and NPD aren't the same. So, I think that borderline personality disorder is stigmatized. It's the most stigmatized mental health diagnosis anybody can ever get. And so it's stigmatized way too much. And for people to continue to speculate on two separate personality disorders, borderline and narcissist personality disorders, being the same, it just stigmatizes BPD even more. And I believe, as I think many believe still, it's highly inaccurate to say they're the same. And if they're comorbidly in the same person, well, then, you're going to experience both. But it still doesn't make them the same. So, what's the difference between the vulnerable narcissist, otherwise called covert narcissist or inverted narcissist, and a quiet borderline? Okay, this one's getting too long. But anyway, so I'll just run over the traits again of the vulnerable narcissist really quickly, although I did do a video prior. Helplessness, extreme emotionality, reticent behavior, silent, emotionally restrained behavior, highly sensitive people. They take offense to the slightest emotional reaction if they feel criticized, or like you don't think that they're right. They don't know how to tolerate that if you think they're wrong. Or you leave them somehow feeling inferior because they're highly insecure. These all narcissists, but these vulnerable and covert, otherwise known as inverted narcissists. So the vulnerable narcissists believe they are perfect and that you fail to see them for all they are. You fail to see their superiority. Superiority that's an overcompensation for their deep insecurities. They withdraw from others because no one will ever be good enough to engage in a relationship with them. That's their thinking, that's their belief. They're looking for some fantasy person that will be perfect for them and get them totally. And they're the vulnerable, otherwise known as covert narcissists, so they're hard to spot in the first place. And this fantasy person they need is really non-existent. And it's interesting because they're going to be presenting you some kind of a fantasy person that's non-existent when you first meet them. Probably another projection, narcissistic projection. They cannot tolerate any questioning of their self-perception or beliefs about self. They'll play the victim. Nothing is ever their fault. It's everyone else's fault. They have passive-aggressive behavior, but again, it doesn't look anything like the overt grandiosity of the overt narcissist. They give they can exhibit false humility convincingly. They give shallow pseudo apologies that aren't really apologies, but they seem like apologies sort of at the time. They can present as bored, aloof, condescending, and judgmental, but not in a grandiose way. They punish others with silence, suffer chronic feelings of emptiness, or experience emptiness, not always a feeling state. The vulnerable narcissists are covert and sneaky, unlike overt narcissists who, are pretty obvious. So, notable and important differences between, here's the differences that apply to a vulnerable or covert narcissist, okay? that are different from the quiet borderline. The covert narcissist demands or insists on unwarranted personal recognition, even in small ways, which identify them as special or a higher ranking than others, superior, in other words. The narcissist, the vulnerable narcissist, needs special treatment. They need to feel like you believe that they feel or are superior and special. The absence of self-harming and dissociation in vulnerable and otherwise known as covert narcissist is a major difference from the quiet borderline. And the vulnerable covert, otherwise known as covert narcissist, attitude of being better than is also the opposite of the quiet borderline attitude or feelings. The vulnerable, otherwise known as covert narcissist or inverted narcissist, won't have any psychotic episodes. They withdraw because no one will ever be good enough for them, so they're feeling way above everybody else, unlike quiet borderlines. And they have a fantasy person that's non-existent, and to the victim nature and reality inside of the insecure, vulnerable narcissist or covert narcissist, or otherwise called inverted narcissist. So then the quiet borderline, I did a video explaining more about the quiet borderline, and now what's the differences in the quiet borderline from the vulnerable narcissist, otherwise known covert narcissist, otherwise known as inverted narcissist. Well, the quiet borderline gives little weight to egocentric matters of grandiosity or specialness. In fact, they feel less than, broken, not good enough. So shame is operating in both of these personality disorders, by the way. But the narcissist, the vulnerable or the covert, or the overt for that matter, they have shame, but they're unaware of it. They're not self-reflective. They're not self-aware. They feel less. They have no empathy, by the way, and they feel less than does any borderline. But the quiet borderline is who I'm talking about here in comparison to the vulnerable or covert narcissist. So where the covert narcissist or the vulnerable narcissist feels special and above and better than, the quiet borderline doesn't have any sense of that at all. They don't know who they are. The vulnerable narcissist isn't actually feeling that much feeling. The quiet borderline is feeling tons of feelings that they don't know how to cope with. They're way over feeling everything in extreme ways. The quiet borderline feels unworthy and undeserving. So they, like I said, they feel really less than, whereas the vulnerable narcissist or the covert narcissist, same thing, feels way superior. But so that's quite a difference there. And the in air quotes, entitlement issues seem very strong. No, actually, the entitlement issues are very strong in a covert narcissist or a vulnerable narcissist, but the quiet borderline doesn't feel entitled. The quiet borderline just feels unworthy and broken and really like they can often just feel like they're worthless, totally worthless. So that's quite a difference. The observable dissociation in quiet borderlines is not observable or present in the vulnerable or otherwise known as covert narcissist. Quiet borderline self-harm, and narcissists don't generally self-harm. Or if they would have some other elaborate way of doing that, like they might drink, which is like self-harm if they become alcoholic, or get addicted to something. But the thing is, the quiet borderline will self-harm, and the covert or the vulnerable narcissist usually don't self-harm. And so the quiet borderline experiences depersonalization, feeling zoned out a lot, and derealization, feeling unreal or experiencing a disruption in whatever sense of self or self-perception or what's really happening in the moment. that the borderline has any perception of, to the degree they have perception of self or what's happening in the now, with or to them. And that's not what's happening with a vulnerable, otherwise known as covert narcissist. They aren't suffering depersonalization or derealization. They don't even have any awareness, or like it's just totally different. So again, a total difference there. And this difference holds with the acting out, raging borderline as well. These differences hold. Um, so anyway, the couple more points is that the quiet borderline, many experience brief or transient psychotic episodes. The covert or vulnerable narcissist, not psychotic. That doesn't have psychotic episodes. If it's just, narcissistic personality disorder without something else comorbid. So the borderline tries to fill the void inside themselves with new and exciting relationships sooner, like, or later, but like really gets involved where because they need people, they need somebody, they don't know how to be alone, and they don't have this idea that there's nobody good enough for them. They feel more like they're not good enough for anyone else, but they want a relationship really badly. And then, of course, they have the I hate you, don't leave me, the approach avoidance problems, the engulfment annihilation, like if they're too close, they feel engulfed and like, controlled. And if there's distance too much, they feel abandonment and then they feel annihilated. That's all in borderline personality disorder. In the quiet borderline, manifested differently than the acting out borderline. But those are some ways in which absolutely the vulnerable narcissist, or the otherwise known as the covert narcissist, or the inverted narcissist, is absolutely not like or exactly the same as a quiet borderline or an acting out borderline. But there's a better comparison coming up in another video I'll do, in comparing the overt narcissist to the acting out raging borderline, because still there you can see some similarities, but they're still not the same personality disorder. It just doesn't matter how much people try to find understanding by conflating these things together. That's not where the understanding is. And so I hope that that was helpful. Take care now.